Racism in the United States is a problem that has not diminished over time, as we have seen current cases that perfectly reflect what people of color have struggled with over the years.
In order to understand our current situation with racism, we must study how racism has evolved over time. We must understand the struggles, protests, or events that have allowed people of color to make their issues known and raise awareness of the harm they cause to others.
For centuries, there have been civilizations that practice slavery, the practice of considering one person the property of another based on the region of origin or skin color. When the British colonized what is now the United States in 1607, they brought this practice with them. They enslaved people from Africa, therefore colored. The English at that time believed that the superior races were white and therefore people of color were not considered people.
In 1865, the Civil War was fought in the United States. This war was fought by the northern states to end slavery in the country, while the southern states sought to maintain slavery. Once the Civil War was over, slavery was abolished and black people were granted citizenship of the country.
President Abraham Lincoln in 1863 guaranteed freedom to slaves, and after the Civil War ended, Congress prepared to abolish and guarantee citizenship to all persons born or naturalized in the United States. The 13th Amendment abolished slavery, and the 14th Amendment provided for the granting of citizenship to black slaves.
Although slavery was abolished, American citizens adopted racist attitudes against people of color because they did not consider them equal. And these racist attitudes bias, stigmatize, and exclude people of color. Hatred towards these communities grew to the point that the Ku Klux Klan, an organization that promotes violent activities against black people, was created.
Black people were brutally murdered, beaten, lynched, or assaulted by individual citizens, police groups, mobs, and the KKK. The hatred intensified after the enactment of the Jim Crow laws, segregating black people, assigning them separate spaces for schools, waiting rooms, bathrooms, public transportation, or even movie theaters.
Conditions for black people were inhumane. Even though by law black people were equal to white people, most black people were poor and had no access to basic services such as education, as the entire budget was prioritized for white people services.
Although slavery had been abolished in the United States by 1910, the new reforms brought a new form of exploitation, with little pay and no opportunity for growth, and blacks were barred from voting and interracial marriage.
This series of abuses went on constantly until a series of protests in the 1950s began to emerge. The first being Brown Topeka Student Council, where the USA Congress ruled that segregation of public schools was unconstitutional because it violated the 14th Amendment in 1954.
The year after this happened, Rosa Parks decided to sit in the area set aside for white people. But despite the request, Rosa Parks refused to give up her seat, after which she was arrested by police officers. After her arrest, a group of people protested against this, led by Martin Luther King Jr. Finally, in 1956, the Supreme Court ruled this act unconstitutional and therefore banned the act.
Following these landmark events, the civil rights movement gained momentum, highlight numerous acts of courage and defiance against racial injustice. The years between 1950s and 1970s were marked by pivotal incidents that profoundly influenced the nation's conscience and legislative landscape.
One such incident occurred in September 1957, when 9 African American students, known as the Little Rock Nine, faced violent opposition as they integrated Little Rock Central High School. Despite the hostility and intervention by the Arkansas National Guard, these students, under the protection of federal troops, persisted in their quest for education, symbolizing resilience and the fight for equality.
The movement for civil rights took another significant step forward with the Greensboro sit-ins in 1960. 4 African American students, later known as the Greensboro Four, initiated a nonviolent protest at a whites-only lunch counter, demanding services and equal rights. This act of peaceful resistance inspired similar protests across the country, leading to the desegregation of facilities and bolstering the sit-in movement's role in the fight for civil rights.
Another landmark event occurred in New Orleans in 1960, when 6-year-old Ruby Bridges bravely integrated William Frantz Elementary School. Despite the angry mobs and daily threats, her courage and unwavering support of her teacher, Barbara Henry, became an enduring image of the struggle for educational equality.
The freedom rights of 1961 further exemplified the determination of civil rights activists. Integrated groups of riders faced brutal violence as they traveled through the South to challenge segregation in interstate bus terminals. Their perseverance, despite arrests and beatings, pressured the federal government to enforce stricter desegregation laws.
The Albany movement in 1961 also could not achieve all its goals, demonstrated the power of collective action. Despite setbacks, the movement involving the SNCC, NAACP, and other groups highlighted the persistent struggle against segregation and the importance of unity in the fight for civil rights.
In 1963, the Birmingham demonstrations showed the brutal reality of segregation, led by Martin Luther King Jr. The protests faced fierce opposition, with authorities using high-pressure hoses and attack dogs against peaceful demonstrators. These images shocked the nation and spurred President John F. Kennedy to propose comprehensive civil rights legislation.
The 1963 March on Washington was a historic moment in the civil rights movement, bringing together more than 250,000 people to advocate for jobs and freedom. Martin Luther King Jr.'s I Have a Dream speech remains one of the most iconic speeches in American history, a symbol of hope and an aspiration for racial equality.
The passage of Civil Rights Act in 1964 marked a significant legislative victory, outlawing discrimination based on race, color, religion, sex, or natural origin. This landmark law paved the way for future progress despite ongoing resistance and challenges.
The assassination of Malcolm X in 1965 was a tragic reminder of the ongoing struggle for racial justice. His advocacy for black empowerment and his influences on the Black Power movement left an incredible mark on the fight for equality.
The Selma marches in 1965, particularly the violent confrontation on Bloody Sunday, highlighted the systematic barriers to voting rights for African Americans. The national outrage that followed led to the passage of the Voting Rights Act of 1965, a crucial milestone in ensuring voting rights for all citizens.
Despite these victories, racial tensions continued to flare, as seen in the Watts riots of 1965 and the Detroit riots of 1967. These violent uprisings underscored the deep-seated frustrations within African American communities and the persistent inequalities they faced.
The Supreme Court's decision in Loving v. Virginia in 1967 struck down laws banning interracial marriage, a significant step towards dismantling institutionalized racism and affirmed the right to love and marriage regardless of race.
The assassination of Martin Luther King Jr. in 1968 was a devastating blow to the civil rights movement. His death sparked nationwide riots and uncensored the urgent need for continued efforts to achieve racial equality.
The Boston busing crisis of 1970s and the subsequent Miami and Los Angeles riots of the 1980s and 1990s demonstrated that the struggle for racial justice was far from over. These events highlighted the complexities of desegregation and the deep-rooted racial tensions and persisted in American society.
Despite the progress made, the modern era has shown that racism remains a pervasive issue. The deaths of Trayvon Martin and George Floyd, among others, have reignited the fight for racial justice, leading to the resurgence of movements like Black Lives Matter.
In examining the story of racism and civil rights in the United States, it is clear that while significant strides have been made, the journey towards true equality continues.
As we reflect on these events, it is imperative to remain vigilant and committed to the participants of equality and justice. Only through sustained efforts and collective actions can be hoped to eradicate the remnants of racism.